I'm Ben Ryman, and this is Behavior Speak. In this conversation, Dr. Diakov shares her extensive experience working with displaced populations, particularly children and families in refugee camps. She discusses her journey from studying applied developmental psychology to focusing on resilience in displaced children. Diana emphasizes the importance of understanding cultural dynamics, community support, and the need for culturally responsive interventions in mental health practices. She highlights the challenges faced in humanitarian work, the significance of transnational competence, and the gaps in research regarding displaced populations. The conversation continues. The conversation concludes with Diana's vision for future work in promoting resilience and mental health support for refugees. Welcome to Behavior Speak, Diana.
Hello, thank you for having me here.
Yeah, I'm excited. Before we get started, I just wanted to acknowledge I am producing this podcast in the territories of the Kalamin Kleus, Homoko, Comox, and Seashelt First Nations. And as always, I'm grateful to be here. So why don't we start a little bit with your origin story, how you got into this work in the first place?
Well, since the very beginning of my training, I was working with children and families and traveling a lot. I got my master's in applied developmental psychology in Poland, and there was a bunch of different internships, volunteering, always with nonprofits or crisis centers where kids have been in difficult life situations, or there were families who have been moving for various reasons. And then I got into applied linguistics with specialization in Arabic, and it opened the entire new world of the Middle Eastern culture for me and Arabic speaking culture. And so I started doing a lot of projects in this part of the world. Then I got into a place where I really wanted to connect the educational pieces, the humanitarian pieces, and clinical pieces. And it got me into that intersection of humanitarian work, especially with children and families. Then I got my doctorate at the University of Montana in the States, and I was focusing on refugees. And what I realized in the States was that even though there was a lot of, just talking and information about resettled communities, there was still very little knowledge about what those communities have been through during the migration. It was rather assumed that children who were coming from refugee background, they all had trauma because of war. And even if that was the case for some, it wasn't true for all of them. Some of those kids have been born during displacement in those refugee camps. Some of them have been growing up in those conditions. And I just got really curious about it. So I started conducting research and then just working in refugee camps as I was also completing my doctorate degree. So it was a lot of field work. Then I realized that, just the school psychology discipline wasn't giving me enough of preparation. So I pursued specialized training at Harvard Medical School in global mental health. And then when I got back to Europe, I got hooked on psychotraumatology, which is that very thing that I'm doing on a daily basis since the beginning of my clinical interest. So that's the journey.
That's amazing. Can you tell me a little bit about what it was like in those early days working in the camps?
Well, let me just start with narrowing down the context, because I worked in the camps in Southern Europe, mostly in Greece, the islands and in the mainland of Greece, and also doing some work in northern part of Iraq in Kurdistan. So there was already some infrastructure there in place. However, I happened to work for most part during very unhappy political times when there was a lot of tensions and a lot of changes in the policies, national policies, but also European policies. That continues to be the case, but usually, what I found myself noticing a lot was the difficulties with navigating the educational system and access to public healthcare. And so the kiddos and families oftentimes would be trapped in the camps. They couldn't get the work, they couldn't get their kids in schools, or there was a lot of disruption around that. So not only they came from very disrupted backgrounds with no schooling, no access to regular healthcare, But then for years, they would get stuck in this limbo as well. And for some families, that meant really long years of no access to regular support. And for kids, that meant no access to regular schooling until they got
Hmm.
resettled, sometimes in later teenagerhood. So
Wow.
it was difficult. And then when I worked in a camp in Greece during pandemic, it was very difficult because not many
Hmm.
humanitarian organizations could stay because of political changes. So we had extreme shortage of staff and shortage of resources, a lot of health risks all over the place. The kids couldn't go and utilize public schools the way that nationals could do it. So it was a compound of all the risk factors magnified by the environmental risks related to pandemic. So difficult.
Hmm. And can you just give a little context? So you're in Greece, you're in Iraq. Where are these children and families coming from?
So at that time, when I started in Greece, the majority of the kids were coming from Syria, from Palestine, from Iraq, some families from Afghanistan, and also some Congolese families, Eritrean families, Somali
Hmm.
families. However, around the pandemic, the demographics have changed a bit, especially in the camp where I was at. So there were more families from Afghanistan and African countries. Still some Syrian families, but less so. So over the course of a couple of years, there's been a significant shift.
Wow. So these were truly like multicultural camps that you were involved in.
Yeah, definitely. It was a
Yeah.
lot of different cultures. And, the important bit is that even if those families, were coming from one country, they were oftentimes coming from various ethnic groups,
Hmm.
religious groups. So it is oftentimes it was, kind of a mistake to assume on the side of some providers that because we have Iraqi families, they all along very well. And it wasn't always the case because of religion, because of ethnic tensions around, especially in the Middle Eastern, the part of the Middle Eastern population got very mixed up in terms of where they actually feel they belong. And then sometimes they would find themselves in one camp, building those communities, and the local tensions in the camp would be arising because in a natural kind of environment, some of the communities would never try to even live side by side, and all of the sudden they found themselves in that position. So it was a lot of cultural and just life transitions for the displaced populations, but also, for the providers to navigate those differences while setting up the programs for kids and for families in the camps and making them available and accessible and just also well received by the community.
Wow. And so how long might a family or a child be in some of these camps?
That's a good question, and it depends on the nationality and it depends on the route
Hmm.
that they take.
Hmm.
It can be a year, it can be 25 years. So, for example, for Eritrean families and for Somali families, it really can extend over the course of sometimes decades because they would try to
Wow.
flee through African countries, then going the Middle Eastern route, then going through, Turkey, Europe, and then maybe eventually, for example, to the States. So it's not uncommon in the United States or in
Hmm.
Canada to meet children who have been born during displacement or who have been born without any belonging to a particular state. So those routes can be really, really long. The families that I worked with in a Greek context, their average time of displacement would be a couple of years, up to 8, 7 years. It really depends on also their nationality, whether they were coming with children, whether they were identified as a vulnerable individual based on the United Nations criteria for international protection. So it's a
Hmm.
lot of different factors.
Wow. And just thinking about even the terminology, I was listening to another interview you did a while back. So not all these folks necessarily are refugees. There seems to be sort of different terminology to describe these folks. Can you try to help
Yeah.
me break that down a bit?
So, in a nutshell, a refugee is a person who is forced by circumstances to flee their country of origin.
Mm.
So they may be fleeing war, they may be fleeing persecution, they may be fleeing genocide, anything that is really threatening to their life in the country of
Mm.
origin.
Mm.
And once they cross the international border, they're gonna be receiving, hopefully, international protection under the
Mhm.
label of a refugee. Then we are gonna have also asylum seekers, so people who are awaiting for that protection to be granted. But we also have a lot of internally displaced individuals. So they are still under the umbrella of forcibly displaced people, but within the borders of their own countries. And
Mm.
that is kind of changing. So from when I started humanitarian work up to this point, in terms of the countries that are hosting the highest number of internally displaced people, but oftentimes it is assumed that people who are fleeing war or persecution, they are ending up in those wealthy countries in the northern hemisphere. But the reality is that most of the people who are fleeing because it's not safe to be home are staying in a very, very low resource countries, oftentimes in their
Mm.
own
Mm.
country, but in different region, or in a neighboring country that is already having a massive crisis because of various, economic factors, oftentimes civil unrest, and it's not very safe. And then that's why some of the refugee camps are going to basically have a size of a quite a big city with their own flow and infrastructure within, but obviously not the same resources as in a regular city people would have. So it varies. And then we also are going to have people who have no legal recognition. They're stateless individuals because they were born in
Mm.
between. They've never been granted any nationality, and that causes a number of problems, as you can imagine, in terms of getting kids to schools, allowing parents to have rights to safeguard their children. And there's also a group of people who do not fit any of those categories. For example, in some South American countries, people may suffer from an extreme economic crisis that just makes it almost impossible to live, but they are not fleeing per se,
Mm.
military violence or persecution, but the conditions in the country of their origin are unlivable. So again, they're gonna be displaced, but for different reasons, which may limit their ability to seek support, international support and resources, elsewhere. So it's I would say, a huge term that also is quite limited.
Mhm.
In a way, some of the definitions are outdated because nowadays we start having more and more climate displaced individuals
Mhm.
that sometimes are not going to be able to come back home to their country of origin. And this is a rapidly growing number globally. And the definitions that we have, just focused after the Second World War on war-induced displacement. So
Yeah, of course.
globally, a lot of different efforts from various fields trying to facilitate that protection, really.
Yeah, wild. Okay. Staying in the camps for a moment, I'm wondering if there were sort of particular children or families whose stories have kind of stayed with you.
Let me think. So many of them, and for also so many different reasons.
Hmm.
But I think, always the stories that would get to me were those stories when the family, or even sometimes not the parents, but older siblings who would be displaced as unaccompanied minors with the little ones, would somehow make it work. Just make it
Hmm.
work, not
Hmm.
only through the journey, but make it work in those conditions. So I remember one girl who, she was a young teenager at that time, very bold personality. She would just put people in their place. She would definitely have a lot of leadership around, which sometimes was overlapping with some, externalizing behaviors,
Hmm.
because that was her way of coping. That was her way she was trying to adapt. And in many ways, it was actually granting her some safety in the environment in which she was. She had such a bright mind and just immense ability to create groups, lead them, inspire them. And she would be that self-acclaimed leader that other teens would follow. And eventually she started teaching them music, and she would advocate for them as well. And it just was a lot of self-driven initiative. And she came
Hmm.
there without her parents. So obviously very, very difficult situation. I also remember, one boy, he was at the time 4 years old, quite boisterous. Again, a lot of externalizing difficulties, has been through a lot, a very vibrant personality. He would be everywhere and anywhere, but he came from a very difficult family background because during those transitions, the structure of the family has changed a lot. So there was exposure to severe violence, domestic violence, in addition to the violence he would be observing around in the environment before
Wow.
displacement, but also then during displacement. Um, and for me, when I was working with this kiddo, it was just unbelievable to observe how quickly he was adapting to those very difficult circumstances, finding his own ways. In that given context, it was adaptive. You take this kiddo in a regular school, and it would be all the time, a behavioral report and just concerns all over the place because those behaviors wouldn't be transferable. And in fact, when then he joined a public school, a few years later, he started struggling a lot and would be, stigmatized as this huge behavior kid that is unmanageable, while all of those behaviors in the camp context, in the context of his immediate family, were so adaptive. But it's obviously he needed to work through finding his ways out and find those replacements of those strategies. But it's so difficult when those boisterous, sometimes even dangerous strategies of coping allowed you to feel safe in those difficult times. And I feel like that bit sometimes is missing when kiddos are get finally resettled to a safe country and a safe environment, but they still have those lingering mechanisms that they served a very, very important function in a different context. So in a way, quite resilient. And I could, just think of many other stories of this type where the kids were just so resilient, self-driven, creative, and just hungry for getting better and getting out of that situation, but in a way, very wounded and very, very isolated and rejected, rejected by the society where they lived, rejected by the circumstances. So it was a lot of pain and strength at the same time.
Do you have a credential with the International Behavior Analysis Organization, the Qualified Applied Behavior Analysis Credentialing Board, the Behavior Analyst Certification Board, or would like a certificate of attendance for another organization? You can earn continuing education units by going to www.behaviorspeak.com, clicking on CEUs, and entering the 3 secret words. The first secret word is displaced. Displaced. Can you tell me a little bit more about that work and kind of the sorts of things you found in terms of resilience among forcibly displaced children and families?
Sure. Thank you for that question because, I definitely just, a little bit of background. As I told you, I worked a lot with families and children who have been through a lot of different types of traumas, domestic violence, environmental, community, illness related, and so on. But I just kept thinking, how these kids make it through? What's the thing? It just got me to the place of studying resilience a little bit more and shifting the narrative from pathologizing all those behaviors into finding the coping and the strength in all of it. And when it comes to displaced kids specifically, the research that I've done so far very much so emphasizes that element of hidden resilience, that the things that at the surface may look very maladaptive, they actually are very adaptive, given the exposure to threats that the kids endure on a daily basis. And that spans across many different strategies that displaced kids would engage with, and also cultural strategies that are often stigmatized. So just one of the examples from one of the research projects that I completed was on Muslim refugee kiddos specifically. For example, there's a lot of voices that would say that Muslim girls are restrained and they are not allowed to do a lot of things, that they're oppressed.
Sure.
And in some contexts, that is true. Now, what I found when it comes to some of the camps where that research was conducted was that that family protectiveness around girls served as that hidden resilience factor, meaning that some of the camps were that unsafe because there was no lights. The spaces were occupied by males. There was no programming suitable for girls, Muslim girls. it was just dangerous to move around. So if a girl would go, and a teenage girl, for example, unattended to those spaces where there was a lot of males, sometimes substance misuse, a lot of aggressive behavior sometimes, and just not safe. The risk of sexual harassment, assault, and physical violence would just, be very significant. And sometimes those families that were more protective, and their narrative would come down to, we are so protective because our girls are Muslim and they can do A, B, C, and D, but they cannot do other things. In that very context, would have a protective element to it. Obviously, this is not a full picture, and it's not to say that those families were always, providing a healthy environment for their kids, especially, young females. But I have encountered families who would create that healthy environment for their teenage daughters. And one of the foundations was for them nested in faith and culture. So it's to say that at the surface level, a lot of things look one way or another, but that question what function it serves in a given context is really important. And this is what I definitely learned. And the other thing in a refugee camp context especially is that interprofessional collaboration between people in the schools, in a healthcare system, and humanitarian agencies, and also like policy stakeholders is crucial. And also working with those community leaders. So it is not a very common practice, that people from public schools would work with humanitarian agencies to get the background knowledge. And it's even less of a common practice to work with community leaders. And without working with community leaders, there's not much success really with the programs that are being implemented, because in many cultural groups and ethnic groups, there is a very specific hierarchy of who is a trusted person in our community. So for our programming to take place and actually, strengthen, promote mental health, we would need to work with community leaders, whether it's the eldest of the community or the most respected one. And then when we would have their buy-in, then we would have a buy-in of the entire community, because it would come across as safe and respectful. That, that layer, this is that resilience layer at the environmental factor ground, I would say, where all those stakeholders do play an important role in children's resilience. And that translates to also the environments of the schools and clinics and anywhere else, really. Very much so, the cultural, and also the cultural component, I would say that what I have found is that a lot of caution needs to be exercised by clinicians while working with people with a displacement background. A lot of caution needs to be exercised when we, just working with kids that have a displacement background, because it is not to be taken for granted that, their cultural background is always a source of strength. It can be actually a risk factor. And for some individuals, that would be a source of sorrow, especially for those who have been persecuted for, ethnic reasons, religious reasons. So their homeland is not always the source of hope, strength, and resilience. And this was very visible in the research that I conducted, that narrative around where I come from and what this cultural background gives me, it varies depending on an individual.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I can really see how it's a protective factor. And I'm curious about how this plays out post-migration treatment. When we're thinking about sort of culturally responsive care, we often talk about how it's important to help these children back to their culture and link back to their faith, and not force them into sort of our westernized kind of framework of doing things. But it sounds like for some of those kids, that could actually lead to more trauma.
It could, it could. So it's always a question whether someone's connection to faith is a risk or protective factor. And just recently, I published an article on that very thing, how to integrate spirituality in school psychology practice, but it's really about the clinical practice. So I co-authored that with Jessica Stewart, and we talked about how to assess spirituality without bridging the ethical codes of our professions in mental health, navigating the legal aspects of current times, depending on where we practice. And it really comes down to the art of asking questions. Like, really good open-ended questions without assumptions. So even if we know that the family, let's say, is Catholic and we don't know all, like, what is the intersectionality of that, how that has been practiced at home, what's the story. So if we want to tap into that resilience bit related to it, instead of, asking,
Hmm.
do you pray when you're sad? We get to ask, what gives you strength or sense of meaning when you're sad? How have you been
Hmm.
coping? And, just assessing and exploring, because sometimes the stories that we hear are not very obvious, because we may have a teenager or a child that has a different sense of connection to faith than their family. And that causes actually a lot of tension and stress in the family. And when we work with displaced families, especially, they are going through their acculturation processes in their resettlement stage in Canada or other countries. So they may start navigating those pieces of their cultural identity, but in a completely different context. This is a very fragile thing that if we can
Hmm.
carefully explore, we can magnify that, make space for it in a clinical practice, and really help the individual to connect to those pieces that build them and enhance their strength to cope. But we can unintentionally do also a lot of harm if we don't ask those questions tactfully, but also if we completely dismiss it out of our discomfort, then we also are not doing the best treatment or support
Hmm.
work, because we are not allowing that person to fully bloom in terms of their resilience.
Hmm.
So it's a very difficult thing to do from a clinical standpoint, given the ethics, the law, our own values, and the sense of where we are at things.
Hmm.
But in the end of the day, I think clinically it's really nesting that space for that person that we support and meeting them where they are at, without imposing anything, but also without blinding the things that may be important to them.
Hmm. 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 You had also written about kind of how resilience might present differently across different migrations. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. So those different migration stages, divide them into pre-migration, so those threats that lead to displacement, migration
Hmm.
stage, so it's all of that transition, moving countries, walking, crossing the oceans, being in the refugee camps, detention centers, resettlement centers. And then we have that resettlement or post-migration stage. So this is when the family gets their legal status. They're waiting for the legal status, but at least in a place that they can consider a new home. So when it comes to resilience factors during the pre-migration stage, the risk factors are quite obvious and straightforward, because this is all of the threats and that are quite explicit. But when it comes to protective factors, especially for children, the proximity, and this is for adults too, but the proximity to the event is a factor. So if it's a further exposure, it's like I didn't witness the violence myself, but I heard about it. It still is impactful, but less so. But for children, the biggest protective factor, and this is across all the migration stages, is whether my parents or caregivers or my trusted adults make me feel safe. If they give me the structure and protection, because children find safety in a relationship. So I have worked with kiddos
Hmm.
looking also at the clinical data. Not all of the kids that experience war violence would develop PTSD or trauma-related conditions. So there's a lot of protective factors that mitigate that risk. And one of them is the strength, stability, safety of the relationship with a trusted adult, most likely a caregiver. And also the developmental stage, obviously children that are already older, they can make sense out of things that are happening more so than the young children. The cohesion of the family would be also a protective factor. The sense of belonging, are they having some community around? Are they alone? Are they isolated? Then during migration stage, there's many more protective factors. And because it also depends, let's say if an individual with their family stays in a camp, then access to education is going to be a huge protective factors, because it again gives other layers of support, but it also allows kids to develop their skill sets and practice that socio-emotional aspect of development, ability to exercise their hobbies, interests. And this is also for the parents, whether they can pursue work. The vocational capacity will be a protective factor. Access to cultural, spiritual practices that give that sense of meaning. In the camps, oftentimes the protective factors is also something related to expressive arts, whether it's writing poetry, singing, playing an instrument, sculpting. something that allows, those emotions to leave and alleviate that tension. And a lot of actually programming in the camps focuses on those art therapy based activities. And culturally, this is also very meaningful for many people. So just giving you an example, when I worked a lot with youth from Syria and Iraq, there's a huge tradition of poetry writing and poetry singing and reciting, which is also linked to, for some individuals, it will be, reciting Quran and verses from Quran. But for a lot of people, it will be just reciting poetry. And they would write beautiful, beautiful poetry that would be just a catalyst of, that emotional expression, sorrow, grieving, and so on.
Wow.
That oftentimes would be these tools, would be a replacement for typical, CBT-ish narrative writing, or, just the pieces that we know from Western models that are also narrative in nature, but they don't necessarily map, 100% with the cultural practices. Those cultural practices are there, and they can serve as a protective factor. Then also, family members, are there present? Are they missing? This is going to be a risk protective factor. The status of mental health and physical health in general. Obviously, the kiddos that would come with a bigger baggage in the family, where there's also some abuse or neglect going on, or violence, they're at the higher risk. And then at the post-migration stage, in a nutshell, because this is not an exhaustive list of protective and risk factors, but something that is worthwhile maybe noticing is that cultural adjustment piece, that especially for resettled families in those safe countries already, parents can have a stable work situation and they are able to navigate the culture themselves, because let's say they speak a language and more or less they have that flexibility and they are coping quite well with their own mental burdens that they may carry, then children are going to do much better. For those children that have parents who are not able to navigate the new legal system, educational system, they don't speak a language, they are struggling themselves, this is a risk factor, because it's putting additional responsibilities on children that they are not meant to carry. And one of the typical issue that I would see in a post-migration context is that parents would come to a school or a clinic, they don't speak a language, and then the easy fix would be to get their kiddo to provide interpretation over some really big adult stuff. And kids are used to it, because most likely they have been doing that since very early on, because they're multilingual. If they have gone through the camps, they're multilingual, but it's the entire parentification process and shifting responsibilities in the family and just not allowing the child to fully be the child, because kids who have been displaced are the kids that have been forced to become much older than they actually are. And these have been kids that have lost their ability to be children in many ways. So how parents are coping, or those primary caregivers are coping, is going to give us an answer whether there is a protective or a risk factor. And then a bunch of other things related again to access to external resources. And when it comes to individual resilience factors, it can be, the child's ability to engage with interests. It can be the child's sense of humor also, that sometimes diffuses various challenging situations. It can be their ability to seek meaning, how much agency they feel that they have, how confident they are. So summing up, those resilience protective factors can be individual, relational, environmental, but also cultural, like on a larger scale, historical, political, cultural. So a lot of different examples here.
Yeah, wow, amazing. You talked early on about developing an interest in global mental health, and you've got a recent paper where you're arguing about integrating some of those principles into sort of international school psychology. Can you tell me a little bit more about that?
Sure. Especially, I would love to, especially that this is a fairly new applied field that is developing, and it's really interdisciplinary because it merges public health, policy making, clinical practice, global studies. And I got very interested in that because, as I said, I was already working in the camps, and I felt that my clinical training in psychology was not giving me the context. I had the skills, but when I was going to work with displaced populations, whether in schools in the States or camps in Greece, I was lacking the context of those movements, the global movements and shifts, and how to work with different stakeholders in terms of understanding policy making. What are the factors that are impacting those people's lives? The recent paper that you mentioned explores that avenue of global mental health, but also school psychology, because we are getting more and more forcibly displaced kids in schools, and it's expected that those numbers will be rising, especially in a so-called global north. So a lot of uprooted communities come from the global south with very low resources,
Yes.
and eventually are making their way to the global north. It obviously takes a lot of time, and that is not the story of all the displaced communities. But when people arrive to the global north, we are lacking knowledge and really understanding of what these people have been through. And global mental health is having a few different priorities. One is to tackle the needs of communities who are going through various humanitarian crises, whether war or climate related. But also it's enhancing the provision of mental health, those primary services in countries that are lacking that support. So it's, trying to provide more unified access to mental health care across the globe and lower the health risks associated with various mental health conditions, substance misuse included, because, there are still countries where there is one psychiatrist or one specialized mental health provider per, 100,000 citizens. And even in Poland, where I am from, and where I currently live and practice, access to, for example, child psychiatrists, it's scarce. It's scarce given the fact that we are now a home to millions of forcibly displaced people, especially from across the border from Ukraine, but also from Belarus due to persecution. We know there are some schools that in the classroom you would have 60-70% of Ukrainian kids, and they carry a lot of various struggles. And are we ready to provide that support at the school level in terms of understanding where these kids are at? What is the mental health line of response here? Should we do something, and if so, how should we do that? And I think that just applying mental health models here is not sufficient, because we are lacking that context, and global mental health provides that context, because one of the frameworks that has been developed in the global mental health field is the mental health and psychosocial support pyramid, the levels of support. So, for example, in the camps, we would have various levels of mental health support, and and it's not only a psychologist or a psychiatrist sitting one-on-one with, a person, but it's the community support. These are stakeholders. These are the non-specialized activities that promote mental health, like those art therapy-based activities, or, music groups, or poetry writing clubs, or art classes. This is already bolstering resilience in a way. It can be very informed by trauma and the knowledge of the clinical knowledge, but it's not necessarily dissecting those mental health problems. And then the higher we go in that mental health provision, the more specialized the services are. And this model is adjusted to the very limited number of specialized mental health providers who work in humanitarian crisis, or who work in countries or areas affected by various societal and political and geographical difficulties. And just to give you a flavor of it, one of the programs that is infused by the principles of global mental health is, for example, so-called grandma benches. One of the countries, people found out there's huge onsets of mental health problems, high rates of suicidality, but people were not responsive to mental health treatment provided by the Westerners, and the model doesn't work, and nobody comes to that, clinic, nobody comes to that place to get support. So they trained local grandmas who were respected by that local community, and because of cultural model, they had a lot of trust. So they trained them in a regular, psychological first aid screening, so that they can talk to people, facilitate those referrals. And it turned out that people started coming and sitting down with those grandmas, sharing their worries. The grandmas would kind of, triage, if you may, and refer. And those type of models, are a blend of culturally responsive practice, understanding the context, but also, increasing that mental health services in a way that is responsive to the local community. So, this is my idealistic wish. Of course, we would be able to blend the two, because it's really difficult to just do that work in separation without understanding the reasons why those kids happened to be in those schools far away from their home.
Wow. You also kind of emphasize cross-sector collaboration and capacity building. What do you think kind of successful collaboration looks like, and maybe what are some of the biggest barriers?
Successful collaboration. Well, from this, the experience of my line of work, because it may also differ depending on the context, that cultural humility piece, it's a key, because when we work internationally or culturally, if we just come and assume we're an expert and I know it best and I know what your community needs, it's very condensating, and it's usually a pathway to a failure, because nobody wants to feel that disempowered. And in fact, oftentimes kind of the Western intentions when we come with programs, mental health solutions, or even at the local level, when we have a family that comes from a diverse background comes to our office and we know it best, we're disempowering them. And that also disables building trust in terms of my background, my knowledge, my wisdom, wherever it comes from, is not very welcomed here, because I have to fit into one agenda. And so when, I was working with those various stakeholders, definitely learning and listening to the local context was the key, and understanding how that works, which is not always easy, but, practicing that openness to it and assuming this has to be an exchange where maybe I have some resources that I'm happy to bring in and the reasons why I would like to share it, but the way those resources may be implemented or received, that is a process. And it's going to be a bumpy process. So, just coming from a stand that, I have those evidence-based solutions and I will tell you what to do right now, it's not going to work in many, many contexts, because it's not the language that some communities speak. And in fact, for especially people who have been through persecution and just a lot of mistrust when it comes to relationships with institutions and politicians because of the civil unrest or political violence and war violence, there is a lot of distrust in public institutions now, and just a lot of insecurity around people coming, representing some big agencies or organizations or companies. So we are, dealing in the end of the day with communities that have been gone through really a lot, and they don't have those basic criteria met for a sense of safety. So for developing any programs with the stakeholders, the dialogue is the key. And I would say, as much as possible, involving the local communities or representatives from those local communities or communities that we are caring for would probably create a more sustainable program or the project or solution that we're trying to propose.
Wow. You've written about another concept, transnational competence. Can you explain what that means and why you think it's an important framework for professionals?
Yes, so that comes from that book on displaced populations' resilience and mental health. And again, it comes down to this ability to be flexible and seeking that transnational ability to negotiate those differences, but also negotiate solutions. So again, it's about very much so understanding the local context. So even if I work as a clinician and I provide clinical care, I got to understand the political context, historical context as much as I can without also exploiting my patient. So they're not meant to educate me on it. Of course, I want to stay educated to it. I want to stay open and acknowledge my limitations, but I got to do my homework. I should not be coming, to that work saying, I don't know anything about Syria and why you're here, so you tell me all about it. That's not a very, sensitive way to practice. And that transnational competence allows to seek that connection, as many elements to it, but it allows to stay open and allows us to, or actually guides us or inspires us to stay in that negotiation zone, and really aim for not being just versed and competent in one culture so that I become competent in Syrian culture. And I don't know, I can say it on my CV, I'm competent in Syrian culture, which already sounds really wrong, but that's what the competence kind of stands for. There's some limit that I become competent and that's it. But in reality, it's about becoming competent in that relational negotiation of those cultures so that I can find that space in between me and you. And this is where I'm trying to anchor my competence, in that in between zone. So can I be comfortable with being uncomfortable about not knowing everything about your background, not being comfortable with your values, not being comfortable with my values colliding with yours? Can I try to figure out how to be competent in handling that discomfort? So it's more so about that space in between, and then that, grows and extrapolates onto those relationships with stakeholders when we develop programs, when we work directly with the displaced individuals, when we're trying to advocate, when we're trying to develop policies. So it's really a transferable skill depending on the context.
And so how could professionals that might not have direct migrations themselves cultivate transnational competence in their work?
Two things: increasing the exposure to the diversity, and that can be done directly and indirectly, reading about it, just socializing with people who come from diverse backgrounds, gaining those first-hand experiences ourselves. And again, it doesn't have to be through direct migration experiences, but just using the outlets that are already available even online when it comes to reading stories, trying to maybe, taste the flavors of different cultures and contexts and political situations through relatively objective outlets if possible, so that we're basing that knowledge on some facts, but we're expanding our awareness of those cultures. So kind of stripping off those stereotypes. So now I'm talking about, implicit biases and making the unconscious conscious. It's difficult. This also requires that prerequisite rather, condition that we need to come to terms with the fact that we do have implicit biases and that we do carry some cultural messaging embedded in our system that is showing up in our work with individuals and communities. And so we got to do the homework to just get to know ourselves and where those stereotypes and also implicit biases are. So it's a lot of self-work, and it takes that humility, it takes that curiosity, and it takes, a lot of guided action. And also the other, element that I would emphasize here is just coming to terms with making mistakes. So when we work cross-culturally, with populations that come from migrant backgrounds, we're going to make mistakes and we're going to misinterpret things and we're going to come across in ways that we don't intend. And we just need to focus probably a little bit more on ways to repair. So when we come to a place when that rupture in relationship happen, whether with a patient, client, student, stakeholder, how can we repair? Can we acknowledge that we had some pre-assumptions there? Can we acknowledge comfortably that I just made a mistake? I didn't know. I should have maybe read about it, but I didn't know. Can you hold that space also for me and appreciate my apology and forgive me for that? Because it's in the end of the day about building trust. So if the person I work with sees that I acknowledge my mistake and I ask for their kind of understanding in it, that creates or opens the door for trust building, which is a very important thing in any relationship. So a tangible example here would be that obviously when we work with people with migration experience, languages come to place. So interpreters, translators, and so on. And one thing that I always kind of find troubling when I see is that, let's say a family comes into the office and they don't speak English, and there is an interpreter present by default. Maybe they speak communicative English, but the interpreter is already there. And the narrative is that the clinician would say, well, I'm so sorry, but because you don't speak English, I want to make sure I understand you, so I have an interpreter here. And that's, creates, again, a very imbalanced dynamic, because it's you as a patient, you don't understand me, and I am here in a superior position, so you got to adjust to me. Now, if I want to create a safe environment for people who have been through really a lot of violated relationships, I got to maybe try to say something like, I appreciate where you come from, and I just don't speak your language, and I'm so sorry about it. So I need an interpreter for me, not for you. I need an interpreter for me because of my, and do I have enough confidence to say that? So this is, the question requires a bit of self-work, but it's really a deal breaker. And also just appreciating the fact that some families, for example, will not agree to work with interpreters, because in the US context, when I worked it was a trauma clinic for children and families, a lot of my Hispanic Latinx clients who were coming, I would work with them in Spanish, but some of them would really insist on working in English, because they would have so much stigma from other situations in life of being already resettled or moved to the States, where they would feel like if they talk in Spanish to me, there are some sort of, maladjusted individuals, and they would come with their children and they would force them to speak English with me, even though it was obviously more comfortable to talk in Spanish.
Right.
But they would feel that they would like to spare that suffering of stigmatization for their children. So, the language is a tool, and that transnational competence is also about, again, negotiating that, but also understanding that it's not the black and white, and it's not just speaking the language. Because, in this example, I spoke Spanish and I could work directly in Spanish, but the family had very different emotional needs and social needs around that topic. So can I meet them halfway through and be flexible and not impose my clinical, stance on it, saying that it will be much better for both of us if we work in Spanish, because then I would fully understand you. And, in practice, then those families would sometimes swap to Spanish and in English, and it would be Spanglish, and it would be flexible. But if I pushed for it in the first meetings, probably they would, they would probably not feel very safe.
There's clearly a real role for empathy and humility in the whole process. Yeah. I want to talk a little bit about some potential interventions in some of these areas. In your recent book chapter, you describe culturally responsive CBT interventions for refugee and migrant students. Can you tell me a little bit about some of the adaptations that make CBT more effective for these populations? The second secret word is global.
Yes. So, the model that is described there, it stays the same. It's a trauma-informed CBT. I talked about how to, adjust it on an individual level, but also to the group level, especially in educational contexts. And so a couple of things, because it's so many examples there. Again, first, exploring that background and system of values where the kiddo and family come from, and then trying to extract as many examples and the richness of that meaning making from their culture. So I would use a lot of metaphors in the CBT practice. Also, when, just going even through emotional identification and regulation, because not in all cultures people perceive emotions the same way. So understanding how that works for my client, one of the adaptations includes those different body scans and just, the emotional identification exercises. So not just imposing that, a set of emotions, we got to label them, but sometimes, and that's again was the case for many families I worked with, they would describe their feelings and emotions in terms of various somatic difficulties. And then they would have their own labels, and there would be different labels around distress, because in their native language, for example, in Arabic, they would talk a lot about physical distress and just pains and aches and even a pain of the soul. There will be a lot about the soul and just that rupture, and breakage in the soul. So can we use some of that wording, even if in English it's not exactly what we are acquainted with, vocabulary wise, but just use the client language to depict what they're feeling, because in the end of the day, they need to make that connection between feelings and somatic reactions and their thoughts. Now, when it comes to the CBT and the thought-heavy component, that's the risk area, because this is not an intuitive way of looking at the human psyche for some cultures. So again, for some cultures, the concept of that triangle, if you may, will be rather expanded or substituted, for example, with the soul or spirit, or maybe we would like to also add ancestors to it. So first, again, we got to have a really, really good and rich and detailed clinical interview that is culturally responsive. And then we are pulling from those elements and building those interventions based on that. When we have the vocab around and we know how the kiddo or the family is describing their emotional states and experiences, we can go through various interventions that are helping with coping. And here, creativity is really an open ocean to swim, because there's been already a lot published also in research papers, but also in various books on those practices. So we may pull from spiritual practices, we may pull from meditation practices, we may create metaphors, visualizations, guided relaxations with symbols that are very familiar culturally. So when I was working with teens from Syria, I was leading a CBT group for them that was focused on resilience building. I was using oftentimes metaphor of brewing a tea, because, tea sharing, there is a huge thing, the black tea, like, it's very
Yes.
familiar. We would have various metaphors around their local sweets, and I would just create stories around it, and sometimes even bring that food to the session, because food sharing was very important and powerful there. And, I would create narratives around making that very specific type of sweets and what's the process of it and so on and so forth. Just, trying to make it feel like home, because then clients would receive it, more openly. It will feel less
Right.
threatening and imposing. And it's also, a fun thing to do, because you are also expanding your horizons in a way. Now, with spirituality, again, caution here, because just the fact that somebody is Muslim doesn't mean that they would find it soothing to be meditating on verses from Quran. So that needs to be carefully explored. And if that is the case, I would then embed that in my practice, and I would not impose, for example, affirmations based on self-agency or coping or positive psychology or self-compassion. I would rather pull the verses and ask actually to work with that client to bring those verses from Quran that they find very soothing in various times. And with one teen who was grieving and going through depression also, that was still kind of even preliminary to grieving, because of various other things that have happened. That teenager, just came up in a session with a list of various verses from Quran, and we categorize them into those that are good for soothing sadness and depressive symptoms, those that they are better for coping with anger or sense of helplessness. And they would use them and, meditate on them and engage with them on their own. So there was nothing that I would impose, but rather facilitate. But because we could have this conversation, it was more effective for that teenager, just to engage with it. And then when it comes to, trauma narrative, that doesn't have to be writing, because, I worked with a lot of clients that were not literate because they haven't had that schooling background before. So we would develop, artwork. We would sometimes weave, we would use different media to just create that story and narrative in a form that feels familiar. And, one more thing around that trauma informed, trauma focused CBT is that not all of the kids and teens and families who have experienced displacement can benefit from TFCBT, because two things. Some of them will not develop post-traumatic symptoms, and most of them will have complex traumas. And TFCBT sometimes is not such a great modality when it comes to multiple traumas that have happened across various developmental stages, and pull from different angles of that trauma experience. So maybe different modalities to be considered. Now, if there is that more of a single trauma and the kid is already having those cognitive and verbal skills to also engage, It's also important to consider whether there is no current exposure to threats and trauma. Because, for example, when I worked in the camps, I was not doing the TFCBT. I would work on coping, resilience, psychoeducation. So elements of CBT, but not necessarily trauma processing, because it's so active and raw that you can't really guarantee the kiddo would be safe after that, because the level of hyper arousal and that activation is way too high. Now, in resettlement, post-resettlement contexts, when kiddos are already safe and they can come and engage with, some trauma treatment, CBT will not be the best model for all the kids. But even if it's not CBT and it's, let's say, ARC or it's DBT, or internal family systems, it can be still adjusted. However, not all of those adjustments have been validated through research. So a lot of that comes clinical practice. So it's more clinical practice informed than evidence-based, because it's almost impossible to wish that there will be cultural adaptations for every single ethnic background and story. And in the end of the day, it comes down to that cultural humility piece that I emphasized in the beginning, that even if we know that there is a research paper that, trialed and piloted those adaptations for Syrian population, we got to look at that, get inspired, assume this is great, let me try it out, but not impose it, because it may turn out that that Syrian, kiddo that we work with is actually identifying themselves much more with their, let's say, German dad than the Syrian mom who brought them into,
Sure, yeah.
So they may find those symbols irrelevant.
Yeah, definitely. And I also found your point interesting about it doesn't necessarily matter where they are in the migration stage. And that might not equate to whether it's sort of post-trauma or they're still kind of in trauma, and kind of some interventions are designed for kind of PTSD, and I think other interventions are more designed for kind of this continuous trauma. Kind of segueing into that, one other area that you had interest in studying that I wanted to talk a little about was acts of violence in refugee camps. I'm curious about what some of the patterns you observed and how do they affect children and families.
Again, there's going to be some variety depending on the national and political context and so on. But domestic violence is one of them. It's a lot of research that shows that parents who are going through displacement due to tensions and pressures and stress that they experience themselves tend to revert to more punitive measures. Again, that does not apply to all families. It's not to say that, all displaced families are, practicing violence at homes. Absolutely not. But it's to say that there is going to be sometimes shift in parenting. And especially when working in the camp setting, parenting groups were so important. When we would create space for, just giving support to parents and unburdening them a little bit. So domestic violence, intimate partner violence, and this also impacts children because people live in very confined small spaces. So there would be, a very small ISO box of, let's say, 12 square meters, and you would have several family members there, not always getting along with one another, a bunch of kids. So kids would see oftentimes what kids should not see. And that also involves intimate partner violence. The other thing is the community violence. So it was not uncommon in those camps that, sometimes local delinquent groups or organized criminal groups would try to recruit from camps. So they would be coming in, they would be trying to offer, better life, money, whatever it is, dealing drugs, trying to recruit for various activities. Now, if you're thinking about young teenagers who come with parents or without parents oftentimes, who haven't got schooling, who don't have much prospects for the future, who have seen absolute terror, lost everything, are stuck in the limbo, they don't know what to do. So they're going to sometimes revert to delinquent activities. And this is a downward spiral because oftentimes substance misuse is involved. and people would, try to self-soothe and just numb themselves out. Again, that's why I also mentioned earlier that for some of the girls that were protected by the families, not coming to those youth spaces in the camps was a protective factor, because sometimes those youth spaces would be spaces where you have, a lot of young men with a lot of troubled behaviors, suffering a lot, but also doing things that may not feel very safe. So again, that community violence would be there. And because in the camps, people live in a horrible crowding, and they would wait for their decisions on the asylum, whether they get the papers or not, whether they're allowed to go somewhere or not. Sometimes that, congestion of limited space and high nerves and pressure and hopelessness and helplessness would burst into aggression. Kids would see it, and, it was never pleasant to facilitate the evacuation or participate in the evacuation, because something would happen just next door. We would have kiddos in a child-friendly space, kind of running activities like in a nursery or preschool, and then something is happening there. There's onset of community violence that is quite brutal sometimes, and we would have to, limit that exposure that kids have, and that would be only within the hours where we would be in the camp. What they see at night, sometimes we would hear about it and see it, next day. And in some of the camps in Greece, in the islands, the conditions were so horrible. It's just unimaginable in terms of the crowding, lack of facilities, lack of water, lack of, specialized services. And kids would absolutely be exposed to sometimes the level of terror and the human made, violence that would be sometimes exceeding what they saw at home in terms of the sexual assaults, physical violence towards one another. And that would be happening, in a very close proximity.
Wow. So much. As we look ahead, let's talk a little bit about needs to change and also what gives you hope. What do you see as some of the biggest research gaps right now in the work you're doing?
Again, very little research conducted during migration stages. And, I encountered those difficulties myself. It has to do with a few things. Like, first of all, doing research with vulnerable populations is difficult because of permits. So, when I was doing research in Greece, if I was to research directly children, the number of permits, national permits, the permits from humanitarian organizations, then the permits from the country where that research comes from, it's really sometimes unmanageable. And also the ethics, because is that a priority to conduct that research project while the population is suffering that much? And I don't have an answer for you when it comes to it, but I think that a lot of researchers ask themselves that question, or should ask themselves that question. Is that research a priority? And then, ethics come in place. And sometimes the answer is no, it's not a priority. So how do we gather information? How do we know what's going on? Difficult to find a balance here. And it requires a lot of creative and critical thinking. Also, the research that comes at the moment is mostly from the post-migration contexts. The interventions that are being recommended are coming from those clinics, educational settings, outpatient clinics, already in those safe places. Now, the applicability of it to people who are, for example, currently replaced in Poland, let's say, it's a safe place, but these people are still kind of on a route, hoping to get back home to Ukraine. So applying the CBT model that was tested out elsewhere on a different population in a post-migration stage is not going to fit like a glove. And the other bit is that cultural bit, that we're just lacking data and input from the global south. This is a huge research gap, that when the research is published and created, it comes from the global north. Even if there is some research coming from migration stages, and there's been some influx of it, especially post-pandemic, coming from, Germany, Scandinavian countries, Greece, like what's going on in kind of those in-between stages, we're not getting much research that would explain to us what's going on with the populations in the global south. And this is because logistics, scarcity of resources, language barrier, to be honest, and also access to those research outlets, because there are wonderful scholars, in some countries in South America, Africa, Southern Asia, or even, some Southern European countries that are post-Soviet Union, like the Balkan countries, but they're not getting published. They cannot get
Mm,
published because either language component is a barrier or funding is a barrier. So there's not much equity in that compartment. And it's, not that
yeah.
nobody is asking those questions about those populations. It's that when people do conduct that research, it sometimes doesn't get easily published. So we don't have equal representation in terms of even the
Mm,
scholars that are out there and are publishing. So this is quite problematic. I would say that those cultural bits that I mentioned, we need much more of that bit as well, and participatory research. You know,
right.
I'm
Yeah.
advocate of participatory research, working with the communities, not studying the communities, but working with the communities to find out what's going on, what's needed. Some movement in that department, still some resistance to utilize some even research methodologies that may be less Western, more local, but still valid. So a little bit more of dialogue in the research field overall also would help. But then the publication process prioritizes very robust criteria. So even if the research
Mm,
is very well informed by clinical practice and local context, and that research would provide data that is extremely beneficial for that local community, that
mm,
research will not get published because it does not meet the robust criteria for the international audience. But oftentimes when that
mm,
research is published, it does not benefit the community that was a focus of that research. And I find that to be a problematic gap, that there's that disconnect that, people do conduct the research, take it, publish it, and then the community that provided the source
yeah.
of information,
Right.
if you may, doesn't get much out of it.
Yeah, really good point. Kind of looking ahead, where do you see your work evolving in the next 5 years, both in research and practice?
I have a lot of different ideas, but definitely I will continue working with, the little human beings because I absolutely adore my work, my psychological work, clinical work with children and teens and
Hmm.
families.
Hmm.
Research wise, I really got, interested in the notion of, merging that global mental health and clinical practice. So I will be definitely
Yeah.
digging into it a little bit more and just, promoting more and more knowledge on that refugee mental health bit, because I feel like there's still a lot to be said and a lot to be shared. Eventually in the future, I really would like to kind of develop a clinical research institute here in Poland that focuses on resilience more so than just trauma, and is not only
Hmm.
allowing to conduct research for the communities that are impacted by various risk factors, developing, that research so it can be then validated, evidence, and shared in other contexts, for example, in schools in Poland that do not have access to a lot of evidence-based practices, but also I was promoting that knowledge elsewhere and is combining all those avenues that interest me, but in a more non-profit manner. So those kids that do struggle, they cannot access specialized care. They can come to such an institute, participate in interventions, receive care. There
Hmm.
can be also that element of an exchange with the communities. I'm just thinking about it. So, it's a drafty idea that I'm heading towards because it's
Amazing.
definitely needed here in Poland, and there's an increasing need for those culturally responsive practices. Trauma informed also, because the times are quite unsettled, and in Poland we do have quite a historical trauma burdening us.
Hmm.
So, that's staying close to my heart also as just Pole. So I would be
Hmm.
hoping to just contribute here locally too.
Yeah, this is incredibly difficult work. Just kind of, and final thoughts. What kind of gives you hope when working with children and families who have endured forced displacement? And are there any particular moments that stay with you when things get difficult?
Well, I think that one of the sources of my hope and strength are coming just from my family history that also has elements of migration and
Yes.
displacement. And, in the back of my head is just a deep feeling and belief ingrained, I think, by the generations of my family, that it's somehow sometimes works out. It can be very difficult, but there are ways out of it. And I'm trying, to focus on that resilience bit very much so, on how to bring down those risk factors, how to enhance those protective factors. And I very much so, believe that even if the situation is terribly helpless and hopeless, every single human, even if in a very despair situation, will have something that we can focus on and build that resilience there. And, Viktor Frankl was talking about it a lot, that you can deprive a human being of all sorts of different conditions, safety, the external ones, but you cannot take away from them that freedom that they have, the freedom of choice that they have inside their own mind, the choice to react, the choice to weave that narrative about that difficult experience. And sometimes, if I can be that little catalyst on the outside, trying to find that connection to that narrative, or finding that connection to that internal voice that allows to have that choice, because people would suffer and they would sometimes feel really helpless. They would feel like there's no way out and there's no way my life story will turn into something else. But if I can try to help to find that internal narrator to weave a different story, that gives me hope. And I have seen those remarkable stories when people were making their way out. So, I hold also a lot of optimism and just believe in a good human nature. So it's difficult, and there are, moments where I would sit down and ponder. But in the end of the day, I do have a strong sense of, ability to make meaning out of things that are happening to us and to others.
I love that. Diana, your work really bridges practice, research, and advocacy in powerful ways. Thank you for coming on and sharing your insights with me today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been really a pleasure.
The third secret word is trauma. To continue this conversation, check out episode 139, Threads of Hope, Addressing Trauma Amid War and Civil Discord, with Sazan Razouk, and episode 78, Lived Experiences of Syrian Refugee Parents of Autistic Children, with Abdullah Bernier, and episodes 31 and 32, my special series on supporting refugees from Ukraine. Our first episode, Coordinating Supports for Refugee Families of Children with Disabilities, with Sophie Ganovich, and episode 32, Providing Direct Support to Ukraine Refugee Families with Autistic Children, with Bodana Popowich. You can find us on Instagram and TikTok, and subscribe to our YouTube page at BehaviorSpeak. And if you enjoyed this episode, please leave us a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify.